Hola, ¿cómo están? Mi nombre es Javier Mattio y bueno, en esta entrevista de la FED 2022 voy a tener el placer de entrevistar a Tim Maughan, que está aquí presente ya en el Zoom. Tim es un autor de origen escocés, actualmente vive en Canadá y bueno, nació en 1973 y Caja Negra acaba de publicar su novela Detalle, infinito, que bueno, entre otros premios ha recibido, bueno, The Guardian la reconoció como la mejor novela de ciencia ficción y fantasía del 2019, y referentes del género de la ficción especulativa como Jeff Vandermeer han elogiado a la novela. Que, bueno, para sintetizar, básicamente de lo que trata el libro es de una caída, de un gran apagón global de Internet, ocasionada por un grupo de hackers, y de lo que le sucede a una serie de personajes en ese antes y después del evento. Tim también es periodista, ha escrito artículos sobre temáticas semejantes vinculadas a la tecnología, a la economía global, a la cultura y la política, y también, bueno, ha colaborado con artistas, con cineastas en algunos cortos experimentales, y bueno, ha guionado también la reciente serie de Netflix, The Future of, o El Futuro de, donde, bueno, es un conjunto de documentales breves que abordan temáticas vinculadas a la gastronomía o la botánica, etcétera, de cara al futuro. Así que, bueno, si bien esta no es una presentación formal del libro, me voy a basar bastante en Detalle Infinito para la entrevista, porque me parece que es bastante sustancioso el libro para alumbrar sobre el trabajo de Tim, así que, bueno, lo voy a tomar como referencia para la entrevista. Okay, Tim, if you agree, we can start talking.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay. I'll read the questions on screen because I don't want to miss any information. When I was reading your novel, Infinite Detail, this famous sentence of Frederick Jameson came to my mind that says that we can imagine the end of the world, but not of capitalism. And I thought in a similar sense that we can also imagine the end of the world, but not the end of the internet. So how did you envision this huge crack or internet blackout, and why did you want to write about this?
That quote, that Jameson quote is a quote that's very dear to my heart and has been for a long time. Yeah, it's one I turn to a lot, and it's one I turn to with this book very much. But very much in the beginning, and even that, you know, we can imagine the end of the world, but not the end of the internet was something that was there right at the very beginning. I actually started writing this book a long time ago. It was 2011 that I first started it, and it didn't come out. It didn't get published. I didn't finish it until about 2018, and then it was published in 2019. And it took me a long time because I had a very busy time in my life. I was moving countries and being a journalist and doing other stuff. But originally around that time, around about 2011, 2012, when I started sort of thinking about it and started working on it, and there was a few things that were kind of happening that kind of got my attention. One of the big ones was the kind of WikiLeaks and anonymous stuff that was going on back there. If people remember, there was WikiLeaks were having their funding restricted by companies like PayPal, who were stopping people donating to them, and as a result, Anonymous were launching DDoS attacks, disputed denial of service attacks, against sites like PayPal or other sites that were involved in the kind of back and forth over that issue. And I actually remember a couple of mornings, I was living back in the UK, and I would wake up in the morning and parts of the internet weren't working. Like PayPal was down, eBay was down because PayPal was down. You'd see news stories about it. Even like parts of Google were down occasionally. And it really just struck me. It was the first time it really struck me that this infrastructure might not be permanent. Right? It might not be. We were very reliant on it, and we're incredibly. We would, even then, even 10 years ago, we were reliant on it and really taking it for granted as something that would always be there, you know. And around about the same time as well, I have to mention Bruce Sterling, who's been a huge influence in my work for years, decades actually. He's an incredibly smart and incredibly like prescient guy, and he did a talk around that time. He does his annual State of the Nation kind of presentation on the Well website with community that he's a big part of, and he did one there about post-internet. He was mentioning, like, you know, the same things that I was thinking, really, but you kind of beat me to it. That you know, we assume that this infrastructure is permanent and stable, and that we will always be there, and we will always rely on it. We can build on it and create communities on it and run our businesses on it, and literally, you know, like move over our most vital infrastructure, our most precarious and most dangerous infrastructure over to be managed on there, right? And so there's all that sort of stuff. And then again, like you say, that Jameson quote is so timely. It's always a quote that I come back to. You know, people ask me about being a dystopian writer and stuff, and that's one of those things I always come back to as well. It was that idea. So I'd started writing the book, and I'd been writing the book for a few years, and then in 2014 I did a trip to China with some friends of mine, Unknown Fields, a group of speculative architects and researchers. They used to be based in London, and we did this trip where we did 7 days on a container ship, and then 2 weeks overland in China, and the whole point of the trip was to follow consumer goods back to the source. So in reverse, right? So we were looking at the routes that your stuff comes from China. We even ended up in Inner Mongolia looking at rare earth mining and the awful environmental consequences of rare earth mining. So we were looking at literally where materials was being dug out the ground, and that this is the basis of everything, every electronics, even not electronics, but these rare earths in pretty much all products we use these days. But the thing that really caught me about that was we spent this week on the container ship to start off with, and there was internet on the container ship, which I was surprised at. I didn't think there would be internet access on the container ship. It was very limited, but it wasn't really there for the humans on the ship. It was there for the machines on the ship. It was there for the containers themselves, certain containers, refrigerated ones, reefers. I'm sure a lot of people watching this will know what I'm talking about, because we're all interested in supply chain stuff now after the last couple of years. But those containers would connect to the internet via satellite internet on the ship and talk to the shipping companies and understand where they were and everything. And I'd suddenly realized that this container ship and every other part of the supply chain we saw were nodes in the internet. They were like servers basically in the internet, and they needed to be connected at all times. And if they weren't connected, that system started to break down. And that was another element to it to me, because again, to come back to Jameson, that system is capitalism, right? You know, that is capitalism. Our current form of capitalism are these containers full of quite often a lot of crap coming from places like China and India and places where labor is cheap, and then being redistributed to places where people have disposable income to spend on stuff. And you know, and it's often very small things. It's often you know like pencils and pens and stuff, tiny trinkets and things, not valuable stuff. We always think about, like, we talk about supply chains, we always think about electronics and iPhones and computers and games consoles and stuff as these high-end items, but often a lot of the stuff we're getting from China is very cheap, very plastic stuff, and it's been made in China just because it's cheaper to make it there and ship it all the way around the world than it is to make it just down the road from you, right? And that is such a stark realization about capitalism and how it works. And as the idea that the internet could break all of that just was fascinating to me as a way to resolve that kind of Jameson quote. You know, you can't see the end of capitalism, or you can't see the end of the internet. If you can, then everything kind of collapses. So yeah, it was about looking at our reliance, not just on the internet, but our reliance on this kind of globalized capitalism and how it's hidden from us, and how we don't see it, but you know, it can instantly just go away very easily.
Okay, yes, I read that article of the trouble in China, and it's very much terrifying. And
it is, yeah.
And related to that, I think that intrigues me is how you receive the current pandemics, because your novel was out in 2019, and the story resembles what happened a year later in an inverted manner. In your novel, the internet and the whole world stops because of an informatic virus. And in 2020, the world stopped because of a biological virus. But the internet was almost the only thing that kept functioning like before. So how do you consider this paradox?
Lots of people asked me this at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was like, you know, it was weird to see the same things playing out, but like you say, it was completely different. In the book, there's no internet, and at the beginning of the pandemic, it felt like it was only internet, right? Do you know what I mean? It was like, you know, we were just constantly online like this in Zoom calls. Everything was happening in Zoom calls. I was constantly death scrolling through Twitter to find out the news, and that hasn't really changed. I don't think that's really, even with everything that's happened the last 2 years, I would argue the last sort of maybe 6 years, since 2016, in my experience, certainly for people's experience in North America and Europe after Brexit and Trump got in, it was just this kind of like constant churn that you couldn't get away from, right? And I think the pandemic just kind of like reinforced that and forced us into it. Like, we literally, during lockdown, there was nowhere else to go a lot of the time. You know, you could go out for a walk and stuff, but there was no other way of communicating or feeling like you were part of what was happening, but apart from just staring at this device. But at the same time, we were seeing the same breakdowns that I kind of predicted, for want of a better word, or talked about in the book. There's a very brief mention of pandemic hidden away in infinite detail. It's this one line, someone talks about getting a cold and no one getting better from it, but it's after the collapse of the internet. So it's kind of like this idea that maybe there is a nasty virus going around, but nobody knows about it because we don't have the internet to discuss it. We don't have any kind of mass communication, because that's part of the book. Is it's not just the internet goes away, because we've moved all our infrastructure, TV, telephones, even radio, right? We've moved most of this stuff. Radio plays a big part of it, but most of these forms of communication actually on the internet, they run on IP now, on internet protocol. So it's kind of, you know, if that goes away, there's nothing. Like you say, we were in the opposite situation. We were just kind of stuck in there. But it was fascinating to watch supply chain problems come around. I really think I try not to be too much of a pessimist, because everybody says I am, right? But I think we are, like, you know, it's 2 years out now, 3 years out, right? It's coming on for like 3 years now. I went to the supermarket yesterday. I couldn't buy a tin of tomatoes. There was no tins of tomatoes in the supermarket yesterday. And we are still seeing the kind of aftershocks of this. And I think we're actually going into a period where supply chains are going to become increasingly complex and unreliable. We haven't even started to see the real impact of climate change in supply chains yet. We got a little taste of it from the pandemic, and how, you know, labor shortages can bring everything to, in one part, the supply chain, because they're very long, and one part can bring everything else to a halt. We haven't seen the effect of like a major storm yet, you know, a kind of climate change storm. Or these ports are all very obviously on the coast, so they're going to be very acceptable. They're going to be very endangered by flooding, right? As that becomes more of an issue. So it's interesting that we can have these issues without the internet going away. It was weird. A lot of people came to me and kind of. I got a lot of freelance work. Let me put it this way. Suddenly, one of the things I also do is I write about the future for organizations and companies that approach me to do it. And before the pandemic, I was seen as being too pessimistic, and people wanted people that would come to them and tell them that their futures can be very bright. A few months into the pandemic, people were coming to me and asking me for help, because they suddenly realized that, like, we can't be too optimistic about stuff, I think. Yeah, it was strange. It was a strange one to, and it still is. It continues to be a very strange situation to live through. I think everybody's kind of feeling that.
Okay, Tim. Well, there is a crucial point you make in the fiction, which is that the internet rebellion doesn't come from people that hate technology and want to come back to a natural state, but instead from people who love technology, or at least that have an inherent relation with it. So the idea that finally emerges is that of a new internet, a virtual system not based in verticality and control and finances and corporations, but in community, a localized web managed by people. So do you think that something like this is possible in the future? And must the internet be permanently changed instead of being disabled?
I have to think it's possible, right? I think I have to, in order to keep my sanity and to keep myself kind of going. And then that thing about, I'm considered to be a critic of technology, and a lot of people instantly think that means that I hate technology. I love it. I mean, like, I'm surrounded by stuff, right? You know, and I use all this technology to make music. I've got technology over there. I used to play video games. I love technology. I've always loved technology. That's why I'm here doing this now. And it's why I'm so angry about it, right, as well. It's why I'm so angry about Silicon Valley. It's why I'm so angry about tech solutionist kind of philosophy. I'm so angry about the way capitalism has subsumed technology. So yeah, part of the book was to try and find a way to come to peace with that and to find other ways of doing that. I kind of, after the last few years, I'm kind of like, I kind of hate social media now, but I didn't used to. I used to love social media. I used to enjoy it. I still enjoy aspects of it. I met my wife on social media, right? You know, and I've got so many friends that I only really have contact with via social media. But it's become so toxic in the last few years. And again, it's something the pandemic seems to accelerate. A lot of the stuff that I was talking about in the book have just become blown out of kind of weird proportion now, I think, in the last few years of politics and the pandemic. So I do believe that the technology itself, there's a bias in this technology, which we could talk about for hours, right? The bias into how the technology is built and how it's trained and how, especially when we're talking about algorithms. But I do believe in technology as a positive force, ultimately, if it's used for people and if it's accessible and equitable, right? There's projects now. There's some interesting projects, and Stokes-Croft in the book, that kind of network project is based on real life projects. Right? There's projects in a lot of major cities. I don't know what's happening in Argentina, but like in London, there's projects like this. In New York, there's a couple of community level internet projects. Most of them at the moment, though, they're not about disconnecting from the internet. They're about providing access to people who don't have it. Like in, you know, some boroughs and some neighborhoods of New York, it's very hard, especially in dominantly black neighborhoods, dominantly immigrant neighborhoods. It's hard and expensive to get internet access, right? Because the technology was never put there in the first place. So there's a lot of projects springing up to create kind of Wi-Fi, community level Wi-Fi networks, which are similar to what's happening in Stokes-Croft in the book. But I just wanted to push it out a little bit further and see, you know, what if that was the only network, and what if the communities were allowed to kind of organically create themselves around this technology. And also in the book, it's problematic, right? I wanted to point that out because it's too easy a solution in some ways. And a lot of people, as we know, who get involved in doing these projects, they come from a kind of, almost like a kind of white savior kind of position where they think, you know, they can come in and, just like technology companies, a lot of people I see doing activism in technology, even though their heart's very much in the right place and their ideas are very much in the right place, they're still kind of dropping this technology onto a community. It's still kind of sort of, you know, top down technology. And I wanted to kind of like play with that a little bit in the book and show how that might not work, or how it doesn't scale, right? It doesn't, you know, these technologies look good on paper and they don't scale, which is the same problem we've had with social media. The book's not there to give any answers, it's to ask questions, right? And that's all my fiction work. I'm not really interested in providing answers because I don't have answers, and I don't want to be arrogant enough to think that I do, or that, you know, I have a great solution for things. Really, the book's there for people to ask questions and to kind of understand and think and go away and ask their own questions and think about their own solutions and stuff. But yeah, I do think there's potential there. You know, friends of mine who are academics who think about this stuff, there's a lot of talk about, you know, what if you took social media and handed it to libraries or something that was organizing, you know, break up Facebook and give that infrastructure to a public organization to run rather than a private one. And that stuff's interesting. It doesn't make a lot of the issues around moderation, so-called free speech and harassment and stuff like that. It doesn't make those issues go away, but it means that we're answerable to a public or a public common rather than to a private corporation, if that makes sense.
Okay. The internet crack is provoked by a fictional hacker organization called Drungards, whose digital manifesto, that is very great, exposes very clearly all the systemic issues we are discussing. And the real anonymous also appears. What's your idea about these anarchist web entities? And do you think if their actions can reach such a powerful outcome as an internet crack or something similar?
It's so, yeah, I kind of always wanted, when I started writing a book, I always wanted to have this kind of anonymous style organization. Well, there was LulzSec. I don't know if people remember LulzSec. They were another hacker group that were involved in a lot of leaks and stuff around about the time I was talking of earlier with Anonymous and the WikiLeaks stuff that was going on. I always like that idea of them being anonymous and them having access to this technology that is very illicit, but kind of government controlled and designed. So that was very much, you know, my brain's gone, I've forgotten the name of the virus, but the famous virus that was allegedly created by the Israeli security forces and the US and used to take out nuclear research sites in Iran. And that virus, because it spread, and it looked like it had the potential to spread quite dangerously for a while and kind of jump out of the automated systems. It was meant to destroy automated systems, right? It was meant to make centrifuges that were being used for nuclear weapon development, make them spin really, really fast so that the motors burnt out. But you could also, the same technology behind that is the same technology that's used in water pumps in like sewage plants or water plants or any kind of industrial site. They all use the same operating system and the same chips behind these kind of automated pumps. So that weapon could be very easily used to take down public infrastructure, to take down a city's water supply with sewage supply and stuff. And there's hints that has been happening in the book. And I was just fascinated by that as a kind of, what if that got into the wrong hands or the right hands, maybe depending on your opinion and your view. Yeah, I think we haven't seen a lot of, well, I was going to say we haven't seen a lot of kind of direct action against internet infrastructure, but we have last year in 2020, I don't know how much you guys would have seen that, but in the UK, there was people setting fire to 5G telephone transmitters, right, and masts, because they thought they were causing COVID, right? So that kind of, it's weird. It kind of, some of this stuff happened, but in such a weird and bizarre and wrong context that were based around, you know, the most sort of mind-blowing of kind of conspiracy theories that 5G signals were triggering people to get COVID. It's kind of weird to watch as someone that kind of is fascinated and intrigued by, you know, what happens if you do direct action against internet infrastructure, to see it happening for the worst possible reasons, right? And like in logical reasons was kind of jarring to see. But I think that's something that we're going to be, I personally think we'll see more of in the next few years. I think we'll see, as people make that connection closer between what's going wrong with their lives and what they see wrong in society with internet organizations, with internet companies, with the infrastructure itself, I think we will start to see attempts at disrupting the infrastructure directly. Even like for environmental reasons, right? You know, I mean, the crypto market seems to be collapsing at the moment, but I'm not sure that it's gone away. And I think that, you know, there'll be a point where as the environment gets worse, as the environment gets worse, I think people will start to take more direct action. I'm not sure about that, to be honest, because after watching how the world reacted to COVID and didn't unite and didn't take action against certain things, I'm not sure. But I like to think that, you know, we're looking at, as things get bad in the environment, we're looking at a new era of kind of activism and protest against that. And some of that is going to be directed against the internet itself, I think.
Okay, Tim, where I see evident connections between your work as a journalist and your work as a writer. You mentioned that creepy and at the same time outstanding article on the web from that voyage from Korea to China, and that I think is some sort of heart of darkness from the 21st century in a way. And I'd like to know more about that experience and how your articles communicate with your fiction.
That's a really good question. I don't do an awful lot of journalism now. He says that, I say that I'm actually just written, I'm in the middle of writing an article right now for a magazine, and I wrote one last week. I used to do, that used to be like my main kind of, writing that, those kind of features was my main kind of work really. And what I used to really, I wrote for the BBC quite a bit and a couple of other larger websites. And the BBC in particular, I really enjoyed writing for them because it's such a big audience, right? It's a huge audience, and you're able to talk about stuff that those readers wouldn't necessarily be aware of, especially back then. Supply chain stuff was kind of not something people were talking about. People who knew about container ships and that stuff looked cool and everything, but wasn't really kind of like a kind of popular, there was interesting books that have been written about it and research, but not really kind of like a popular kind of dive into how that looked from the inside. So that was really exciting to be able to do that. But at the same time, I found it very limiting because for obvious reasons, the BBC being a state broadcaster, it had very strict rules on impartiality, which it should have, I think. And it was very much, even though I was able to give a flavor, hopefully, and a kind of sense of what I'd seen and stuff, at the same time, I had to kind of leave both my emotions and some of my political views kind of at the door when I go into writing those things. And I think that for that kind of journalism, that's absolutely fine. I wasn't complaining about that, but I still came away from those experiences feeling that I needed something else, that I needed to create something else. I needed another outlet. It was an incredibly emotional experience, and it left me with a lot of questions and a lot of ethical issues. Like the thing with the container ships, they're like unescapably cool at some reason, right? They look cool. The technology is strange. When you go to these ports, like I talked about in the article, the scale is massive. They're just huge spaces. These megaports in China, particularly. I mean, every country has these ports, but the ones in China seem, from what I've seen, just seem like on another scale. You can see like these fields of containers kind of stretching out to the horizon. The cranes are huge, and it feels very science fictional, right? It feels very much like a, in a set for a science fiction movie, and that is really exciting, and it's really, really like enthralling and hypnotizing to be in those spaces and look at the kind of the dance of the containers being loaded and the cranes constantly running and everything, and just being surrounded by this kind of like planet scale technology, right? So it's this technology that literally wraps the world, right, and touches every part of it now. That's really exciting. And then 2 weeks later, I was stood in a factory in Yiwu in China that made Christmas decorations, and it was terrible. The conditions in there were awful. It was August and it was incredibly hot in there. It was very badly ventilated. Most of the people working in there seemed very young, teenagers at best, most of them, and they were getting paid very little for this, to make these just pointless little things you would hang up at Christmas, little trinkets, literally, out of plastic. And it was stuff that I really thought, I think a lot of us probably assume is being made in a factory somewhere by like a large factory is pumping this stuff out. Robots are doing it, or machines are punching it out, and it's not really like that. It's actually, most of it is really kind of like handmade. Stuff is injection molded, but then stuff is painted on by hand and other stuff. And there's videos on my YouTube account of what I saw there and stuff. And it was really, really upsetting and really humbling. And then you realize that this huge infrastructure, these container ships, these massive ports, this network that spans the whole globe, it literally exists really just so that these things that you buy for $1 in a dollar store, these things can be made as cheap as possible in the other side of the world by people that are poorer than you. And it was just like, it was kind of devastating for me. And I felt particularly guilty because I'd loved being on the container ship, right? And I'd loved seeing this infrastructure and kind of marveling at it. But then the real harsh reality of capitalism was just kind of like thrown in your face by seeing what it's actually used for. And the billions of dollars that are spent on building this infrastructure just so that people in North America and Europe can buy buy rubbish for cheap, buy trash basically for cheap that they don't need. And that was something I kind of wanted to, I was able to hint at in those articles I wrote for the BBC and for Vice and other places, but I couldn't get that emotional kind of despair that I personally had, like this kind of existential kind of like, oh my God, what are we doing kind of crisis out. So I started writing that in fiction, and I wrote a couple of short stories about factories and what I'd seen to kind of touch it. One was a science fiction short story about Christmas that was published by Vice, by Terraform on Vice, by Merchant's excellent fiction project. And the other one that wasn't science fiction at all. It was just very mundane and very repetitive. And I just published that on my Medium account. And I suddenly realized that this was what I wanted to do as a journalist. I kind of wanted to do that serious journalism, but I also realized that I could kind of augment it with this fiction, right? And kind of allow me, hopefully the two paired to each other give people a different view of things, but that really wasn't important to me. It was more personal. It was more about kind of dealing with my own ethical issues about being a journalist, reporting into this stuff and not being able to shout about it, right? And not being able to scream about it. And I think journalism has changed a little bit since then, and it's probably, that line constantly between opinion and reporting is blurred. I was more interested in blurring the line between fact and fiction, though, because I really believe in that. I don't know who to attribute the quote to. I know Alan Moore has often said it, but that idea that sometimes fiction is the easiest way of telling the truth, and I think that's increasingly true. I think it's increasingly true now, where we just live in a world that's built out of fictions, right? I can't remember the exact quote, but J.G. Ballard said, decades ago that we all live in it's hard to write novels now because we all live in a giant novel. Like, we're constantly bombarded by advertising, which is all fiction. The news is a weird mixture of fact and fiction. Everything we do, we pick up our phones, we turn on TV. Fiction is, we live in a world built out of fiction, right? And I think we shouldn't shy away from that. Obviously, there's a lot of issues around, fake news and stuff like that. And it was fascinating. I had a short story after Trump won in 2016. Terraform at Vice came and asked me to write a short story about that, because people had been saying about Trump, that's impossible. He says he's going to bring iPhone manufacturing back to the US, and that's impossible. And I was like, it's actually not impossible. It's very, very nasty. It would be done under very horrible conditions, but it could be done, because I've been looking at special economic zones in China, and increasingly in Eastern Europe, and in places like Dubai, where the usual laws of economics are suspended for people working in those places. So stuff becomes very, very, the economic difference between the value of an item in that space and outside that space is completely changed, because it's in capitalism's magical purpose to do that. It's in their interest to do that, right? So, I got people making iPhones in Shenzhen who can't afford an iPhone when they step out of the factory, right? Even though that stuff's being made right there. And that stuff fascinated me. So I wrote this short story called, what was it called? Flyover Country. So it's called Flyover Country, which was about iPhone manufacturing coming back to the US in Chinese and US government controlled special economic zones. And that got published, and like within 24 hours, I think a few hours of it being published, it was going around the internet and people were calling it fake news, and it was quite clearly a piece of fiction, right? It was a piece of fiction published in a fiction publishing website, and it was very obviously a short story. So that stuff was fascinating to see those lines blurred anyway. But I just find that especially at that time in my life and my career, that was just the most rewarding thing, was to go away and do this research, report on things, and then come back and write fiction about it. And that obviously is how the novel came about. I'd started writing it before I kind of got into journalism, and certainly before I went to China and did that reporting. But that really shaped the book, this idea that I had limits to my journalism and there was things I couldn't explore, especially emotionally, that I really needed to for my own, if nothing else, maybe even just for my own mental health in some ways. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Sorry.
Yes, yes. Well, I fear this is a very wide question, and you talked about this a little bit. You're living in Canada right now, and well, and infinite detail happens between Great Britain and North America, specifically between Bristol and New York. So what have you learned about living between these both continents, and how you have passed through recent political phenomena such as Brexit or Donald Trump or the Black Lives Matter march that
Yeah,
you wrote about?
That's a really good question. I started writing the book. I was living in Bristol when I started writing the book, and initially the book was going to be set just in Bristol, and it was meant to be very local, like, because everything's collapsed. One of the themes in the book is that you don't know what's going on. You might not know you certainly don't know what's going on in another country. You might not know what's going on in a different city. You might not know what's going on in the next street or the next neighborhood, right? Because that kind of collapse has happened and everybody's become kind of siloed, and it's feels weirdly familiar after lockdowns in some ways, but like we were saying earlier, we still had the internet then. And then, like midway through writing that book, I actually fell in love and moved to New York to be with my now wife, and we're living here in Canada. We've been living here for 5 years now. But she'd been living in New York for years, so I moved there to be with her, and that just changed the book. Just New York just changed the book for me, and I had to realize that the experiences I was having there had to be brought in and incorporated into the book. And one of the things I wouldn't ever say I was involved in the movement, because that would be incredibly arrogant of me, but I did go on Black Lives Matter marches when I was in New York, because it was impossible to look away from what was happening. And this was, I'm talking about sort of around 2016, 2017, I guess, 2018. So a long time before what happened in the summer of 2020, where it wasn't so much Black Lives Matter, it was more the police that were rioting, right? In New York, it was the police deciding that they needed to reassert their fascist control and like via very direct violence against predominantly Black people in cities all across America. It was just terrifying to watch. So that was. There's a lot of stuff that I could, like I say, it's a big question. And talking about, like, for example, to take that idea of racism, I grew up in the UK, and I did a sociology degree, so I had this kind of theoretical understanding of race theory and the history of racism in the US and in Europe, and I'd kind of seen, as obviously, as a white man, I as an outsider, I'd seen how communities and racism and the police interacted in the UK, and it was bad in a lot of ways. Come to the US, and it was very different. And I don't want to say that. I don't want to say that the US is more racist than the UK or Europe, but it's very different. It's very different kind of racism, or how it plays out is very different. Let me put it that way. The thing that really surprised me coming to New York, like day one landing in New York and going to Brooklyn, was segregation, that there was Black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. And that isn't so much a thing in the UK. It is, but it also isn't. It's more class, what used to be more class kind of based, right? Poor Black people and poor white people were often in the same neighborhoods when I was growing up in the UK, and that creates a different relationship to solidarity and racism and these kind of things. So that was very jarring for me when I moved to the US, and then to watch just endless stories about Black men and women being executed in the street by the police for things that I could do, without thinking twice as a white man, was just. It was terrifying. It reminded me of being a teenager and watching apartheid news from South Africa in the 80s, and I really realised that actually things were very similar in the US, right? Not formalised. The US is very good at not formalising its oppression in some ways, but it's still there. So yeah, that was one of those things. But then, like you say, just to watch this kind of weird 5 or 6 years of political upheaval starting with Brexit, which just, I'm still recovering from that now, I think, to be honest, like, you know, and as someone that had grown up with the EU as this kind of, it's an awful imperialistic force. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. It's an awful force for neoliberalism and neocolonialism, right? But it's also, when you're there, it's, and you're a young person growing up in a European country, it's exciting to be able to cross borders like that and to be able to go places and have those privileges that you have as an EU citizen that you don't, that people outside the EU don't have, right? Like, not just before I moved to New York, I was living in Bristol. And I wanted to get out of Bristol for a while. Literally packed a bag and got on a plane and flew to Amsterdam, and I lived in Amsterdam for a few months. There's no paperwork involved, none of that. See, that sort of stuff to disappear was the first thing that was really jarring and felt really, really regressive about Brexit. But then to see why it had disappeared and how it had revealed like the fears and the kind of prejudices of a lot of the British public was, I knew those things were there, but I didn't think they were going to raise their head in that quite a drastic way, and it's quite a violent and forceful way. Yeah, it was deeply upsetting. So yeah, it's been that, but then to see the same thing happening in other countries, right? Just like not Brexit, but the same swing to the right happen in other European nations, and then obviously happen in the US. There's this real sense that there's something happening, and it really comes back to a lot of the issues. Comes back to a lot of issues in the book, and it comes back to a lot of issues in that manifesto that you mentioned earlier. I think the world is incredibly complex now, and these systems, whether it's politics or the internet or the economy, the stock market, supply chains, obviously, these are very complex systems that control our lives very directly and indirectly, but they're not ones we have, let alone control over, but we don't have an understanding of them, right? We don't really understand day-to-day people in the street. We don't understand how they work. It's not just that we don't understand, it's also people working within them don't understand, and the people responsible for them don't understand, because they've literally become so big and so complex that it's impossible for at least one person or even a team of people to understand. And that kind of distributed knowledge from my studying of, say, supply chains means that there isn't anybody that understands how supply chains work. People understand very, very well in a lot of detail how one part of it works. The part right next to it, they might not understand at all, right? You might understand how container ship economics works, but you don't understand how port economics works even. I mean, certainly might not understand how manufacturing is, or you might, you know, understand how to set up, you say you're creating a product, you might understand how to set up manufacturing, but you never see the factories that's made in. They're literally, you know, lines in a spreadsheet or in a software application that you're using. And that stuff, to come back to Brexit, that stuff really, and politicians don't understand it either. Sorry, that's my main point, is politicians don't understand this stuff, and they don't have control of it. You know, Biden doesn't have control over the US economy, really. He can't, you know, he has to kind of make proclamations like, I think there should be a break on fuel tax for a few months. He hasn't got the ability to do that. Like, he just suggests it as an idea. And I think this was a lot with Obama, when Obama came to power on this kind of hope and change message, and then got into power and realized that maybe he couldn't, or the people who voted for him realized he didn't have those powers. I think this stuff's had a real disastrous impact on democracy, in that we've started to realize that, I think a lot of people started to realize that politicians don't have control, and that things are it's unable to understand them, but they don't understand the reality of what it is for obvious reasons. So it's very easy for someone like Trump or someone like Nigel Farage or Boris Johnson or the Brexit politicians to come in and resort to the old classics of fascism and literally just start scapegoating people for this stuff. Like, you know, if the economy is struggling in the UK, if there's not enough money for the health service or something like that, then you can blame that on immigrants. You just say it's being swarmed by immigrants, but that's not what's happening, right? The fact is that the UK government doesn't have a control over its economy and isn't able to fund this stuff at the same time as funding its military. And it's the same in the US, right? And so there's this kind of this disconnect between what people understand reality to be and what it is, because of this complexity that is very easy to exploit by sort of strongmen politicians, by mainly right-leaning politicians You can come in and point at existing politicians and go, these people are weak, they don't do anything, they're corrupt. The reality is politicians aren't actually able to change a lot without big drastic measures. I think they can make big drastic measures. Heavy regulation of the economy, financial industries, heavy regulation of the economy, heavy regulation of how supply chains work and working conditions and labor conditions. This is all stuff that can be done, but it's seen as being expensive or somehow impossible. It's, again, Jameson, right? You can't see the end of capitalism. You can see the end of the world, but you can't see the end of capitalism. Or Mark Fisher, right? This capitalist realism kind of thing. We're not able to imagine outside of this concept of changing what already is. So instead, people think that people are corrupt and lazy and able to do stuff, and that really, I think that's really, to me, that's really the grounding for what happened with Brexit and how Trump has come to power.
Okay, talking punctually about Bristol, you've shown a special interest in music genres that resonated there in the 90s, such as jungle or drum and bass, which for some critics were the last revolutionary sounds that came before the internet. And there is this obvious connection with hauntology and the writings of Mark Fisher or Simon Reynolds. What do these sounds tell of our present, and what do they bring from the past or from the future? And I also want to know about those synthesizers and instruments that you have in your bag.
I make music, but it's strictly a hobby, and it has strictly been a hobby for, like 30 years now. 30 years I've been doing this on and off, and this is my escape. This is I come here. I think it's very, and I say this to people, I think it's very important, if you can, to have an artistic practice that isn't your work and that you don't profit from, or even attempt to profit from, or attempt to make money from in any way. And that's really tough, especially if, like me, I've been struggling to be a writer for decades, or I have a lot of friends who are successful musicians, but it's still a struggle. And I think that it's important to have a artistic or creative outlet that is not connected to your well-being in an economic sense and just in a mental sense, right? Do you know what I mean? So I come up here and make music, and it allows me to really turn off for a way that other forms of expression don't, because I'm always thinking about, have I got enough money? It's about politics. When I'm writing, it's like, is this good enough? Are people going? I don't mind. I don't release the music I made, so I don't care if it's rubbish. It's fine. It's kind of just there for me, literally just there for me. But the thing about drum and bass is, I'm 48 years old now, right? I'm an old man now, and I'm starting to understand nostalgia in a way that I always didn't understand when I was younger. I didn't want to understand it. I didn't get it. It seemed repulsive to me. It seemed aggressive. But now I kind of enjoy it, right? And it's kind of nice to look back on the 90s and my childhood and that music, and to kind of just reminisce about it. But at the same time, you mentioned Mark Fisher and you mentioned hauntology, and that is particularly with my musical past and my past in the rave scene in the 90s is very strong. That feeling that hauntological feeling that we've lost something. That possibilities were there that were lost, because that movement in the UK was very exciting. Thatcher was still around, and things were very, very dark in the UK in the late 80s, early 90s. As a teenager, it seemed like you were being bombarded with things you had to do and and the economy was getting crushed in some ways. And just to have that moment where we threw all that aside for a few hours or for a weekend and went out and danced in places that we reclaimed from the collapse of industrial capitalism in the UK, warehouses and stuff. It seemed really liberating, and it was very egalitarian. And it's there, that, like, I was a white teenager from the suburbs. I didn't have gay friends. I didn't have many friends that weren't white, and suddenly I was thrown into this environment where I was, meeting trans people for the first time, meeting people from other races and other groups, I was going to gay clubs because I loved the music so much that even as a straight man, I was like, I've got to go to these places to hear this music. And it was just this massive kind of explosion of being exposed to different people and different cultures with this soundtrack that I absolutely loved, you know, right? And I feel like we've lost some of that, and some of that's in the book, I think, as well. And I'm constantly fighting this battle as to whether it's old man nostalgia, things aren't as good now as they used to be, you know, that things were better in my day kind of thing that people my age do, and the reality that things are maybe not as good as they used to be, especially in music. I'm not talking about aesthetics, I'm not talking about the type of music, I'm talking about how music is made and distributed and sold and how people profit off it or don't. It's incredibly hard to become an electronic music artist now. I mean, the clubs have been closed for like a year, so that kind of destroyed a lot of that scene. But even now, it's like, I come from here when record labels were very important and were very exciting, and were very kind of like post-punk kind of DIY culture, even in techno and jungle and drum bass. It was kind of like, you know, building something and a community from scratch, and then releasing your records and people listening to them and buying them, and you making enough money to do it again, or to organize events and bring more people into that community. Record labels are very powerful. Now that doesn't exist. Now we have Spotify instead. And I just hate Spotify. It's just such toxic infrastructure to me. And you make a song now, and it seems exciting. It seems really, really liberating. It seems the opposite of what I'm talking about, right? In that I can sit at my computer and make a song now in the morning, and in the afternoon it can be on Spotify and people could be listening to it. But what I'm getting paid for that is nothing. And I don't own that infrastructure, any of it. I don't have control over it. I don't have control over how it's distributed or anything. As soon as I upload, you know, there was everything got commercialized and taken by capitalism in music when I was growing up. But there was a period of time, you know, between, you know, drum and bass becoming the thing and commercial drum and bass, was maybe 2 years, right? Before there was kind of commercial drum and bass on the radio and stuff. Now it's like, it feels like it's that time it takes to upload a file to Spotify, right? You know, it becomes corporate product, it becomes product owned and controlled by Spotify in the time it takes for that progress bar to go up as the file's uploaded. And that is too quick for me. And it's also, you're screaming into the void as well, right? With any kind of content. And I say this as a writer, I say this as a novelist, right? Creating content now and putting it out in the world is it's much based on luck as it is any kind of talent, and whether people notice it, or you're killing yourself. I see a lot of artists putting a lot of energy into promoting their work rather than working on improving their work. And I'm very privileged in that, you know, I don't have to do as much of that because I'm a little bit older and a little bit more established. But I see writers coming up now who spend more of their time, you know, on Instagram or making podcasts and doing stuff than they're actually like getting to work on that art and crafting that art. And I say this as someone who I feel I'm very far from mastering my art. Like, you know, I've still got a lot of work to do, a lot of learning, a lot of practice to do. Yeah, that's the sort of stuff that really kind of upsets me and worries me about this kind of change. That's why that hauntological thing is kind of there, and I feel like we create possibilities. And then we let them go. We let them be subsumed by capitalism and then the internet. It's tough. It's tricky. It's tricky. The music itself will always sound vital to me, even though it's 30 years old. Drum and bass in particular will always sound vital to me. Techno as well as my other big love. I don't make drum and bass much. I mainly make techno and house music, specifically kind of Detroit style techno. And that music will always sound vital to me, even though it's 30 years old. It still sounds like the future to me somehow. And that might just be my nostalgia, but I wanted to put that in the book, and I really wanted that to be. There's not many science fiction books, whether this is a science fiction book or not, which is something I've never really decided. But there's not many of these kind of books that kind of look at these alternate cultures to have this music. Because this music to me, rave music, techno, drum bass, it's faith, science fiction. It's a soundtrack for the future. It's a soundtrack for dealing with the future and thinking about the future. Helps you navigate the future as it's happening to you. So that was very important that I get that in the book, I think.
Well, Tim, we were talking about music, and there is a rather mysterious sentence that you write that says that what really matters are not the beats, but the spaces between the beats. And I think that's a very synthetic illumination of what the language of zeros and ones could carry in itself, which is the subtraction of uncertainty, chance, mistake, and ultimately human dialogue and democracy. I also thought that the spaces can relate to the experience of reading, so to what happens to the reader between one word or sentence and the other. So what does this space between the beats mean for you?
It's so pleasing to hear you speak about a book like this, because that's exactly, yeah, that was kind of it. I'm very, like, for want of a better word, I'm quite pretentious, I think, when I personally, within myself, I try to keep it I can try and keep it private, but when my work, I take it very seriously in a way. I find writing very, very like hard. I'm not the sort of person that you find a lot of writers say, I really love writing, I enjoy writing, I have to write. I'm not like that. I find writing a struggle. I have to be forced sometimes to sit down and write, because I take it very seriously. So it's kind of a chore for me in some ways. So I think a lot about these kind of little phrases like that, the space between the beats. And I can't remember who that quote is originally from. It's not me. It's a jazz musician. I want to say it's Miles Davis, but I don't think it is. I'll have to Google and have a look. But that, yeah, that very much the zeros and one things is very smart, and I think that's very true. It's just this idea that, like, we create meaning not just from the stuff we see, but from the way we interpret it ourselves. When the music with Melody's music in the book, it's very, so much of that music that I love is very minimal, right? Like Detroit techno, drum and bass even. It sounds very busy, and drum and bass sounds very busy and cluttered and layered, and it is, and it can be, but it's also very stripped down, or it can be very stripped down. And there's that fact that you're not just listening to notes or drum hits, but it's the stuff, literally the stuff in between, the silence, but it's never silent, right? It's, whether you're a live musician or you're using samples, there's never silence there. The room is there, right? If you're using if you're a drum and bass producer and you're using a sample break, a sample drum loop, then you're hearing the room. You're hearing how the sound splashes from snare hits, splashes off the walls, and is reverberated and captured by the microphones on the drum kit, and that applies to all kinds of music. And it's something that, you know, those of us that make electronic music, we're very obsessed with effects and use of reverb and delays and things like that to create this kind of soundscape that it's almost subconscious. It's there, but it's this sound in between the sounds, right? And that's a really important metaphor for me. It's I don't even know if metaphor is the right word. It's a really important aesthetic for me. It's it's exciting to me to hear, and the idea of kind of somehow recreating that in my writing is really important. I don't know that it can be done, but that kind of idea that you can be quite stripped back but imply stuff to the reader is something that I've kind of music's such an important part of my life. I have to be honest, it's more important than writing to me. But other people's music, right? Not my music. Listening to music has been the one consistent thing in my life since I was a child, and the one thing that's always got me through stuff, right? Do you know what I mean? Like, just like the last few months of the war in Ukraine and everything like that, and that kind of another doom-laden like news cycle that I'm unable to pull myself away from. When I do pull myself away from, it's music that gets me through these kind of existential crises. Going out for a walk with headphones on and listening to music. It's playing a video game, driving really fast in a video game and listening to drum and bass is a thing that I do a lot, right? Do you know what I mean? That kind of gets me through, allows me to turn off. But it's more, music's also been more than that for me. It's been a real soundtrack to, I know I'm sounding very cliched now, the things I'm saying sounding very obvious, but they're true, right? Cliches exist because things are true. And that music has always been a soundtrack for me. And like I said earlier, it's a way of like, for me, it's been a way of like dealing with the future and like kind of exploring those futures like internally, but with something that kind of catches the energy or the dread or the optimism. And then one thing that appealed to me about Detroit techno, and I don't know if I even realized this when I started listening to it, is that, you know, this is music that was made under some of the most dire economic situations in American history, right? The collapse of Detroit and the collapse of the motor industry there, and people who, as a result, conversely, the technology that came in that collapsed the industry in Detroit allowed people, young kids, to have access to electronic instruments for the first time, right? And that stuff is, it's simultaneously, a good Detroit techno record will be pessimistic and optimistic at the same time. It'll have dark, thunderous bass line. It'll have, like, you know, this kind of industrial drums maybe, but also have over the top of these very kind of almost filmic or cinematic or ambient kind of like high strings and orchestral kind of synthesizers and stuff going on, which are very futuristic looking in a very positive way, right? And feel very utopian. So it's both dystopian and utopian at the same time. And that is my approach to the future in some ways. What's allowed me to navigate thinking and talking about the future for most of my life. I realize now as I'm getting older that the role it's played. And so that's kind of where music sits for me in that. It's really important. It's not just an escape. It's both an escape. The same way Detroit techno is both dystopian and utopian. For me, music is an escape and a way of focusing on the problems, right, at the same time. Yeah, it's much more vital to me than reading and writing, unfortunately. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, you also work with with visual artists and with filmmakers, writing, for example, the script for Where the City Can't See, an experimental short film shot entirely with laser scanners, which follows a driverless car through a phantasmagoric smart city made of radars and surveillance systems. So how do these disciplines influence your writing? What can you tell us about working with Netflix series, The Future Of, that show a more optimistic tone than your work of fiction or articles?
Yeah, so I've been super lucky to work with Liam Young over the years, who I did Where the City Can't See, which was that laser scanner film, LiDAR film, and we made a few films over the time, over years. The other one was In the Robot Skies, which was the first narrative film shot entirely by drones, and that was a few years ago. Now was that 2016, 2017. Yeah, but Liam's also the person that I went to China with, right? So he's also does this. He's an architect by trade, but a filmmaker now by career, and he's based in Los Angeles. We've worked on, like I say, a lot of stuff, and it's really, I love doing that kind of collaborative work. I work with my wife as well, who's also a filmmaker. She makes fictional educational films about issues about surveillance and education technology, and I've worked on a couple of films with her. And also, like, this agency in London called Superflux, who do incredible work. I love working with these people. I love writing novels, and really the only reason I still write novels, if I'm honest, I think, is that the amount of control it gives me. Right, it gives me complete control over that. I have to work with an editor at the end of the process, and I work with my agent at the end of the process. But for most of the process, it's just me and a computer and my ideas and getting it down. And that level of control doesn't really exist for writers anywhere else, I don't think. You have to give up so much of that. I've been lucky to work with those collaborators I mentioned, like Liam and Superflux and people, as very much as equals in that space. But that, because the scale of the projects we're making are quite small and the budget's quite small, we manage to gain control over them. And it's amazing, because I'm not a filmmaker, I'm not a director of photography, I'm not I don't understand these things. So it's fascinating to work with someone on that kind of basis and do that. Like you said, we mentioned Netflix project, and that was a very different project. Like you say, the show just launched this week. It's a strange show to watch, I think, if you know my work, because you can see the things I'm concerned about come through in the episodes, but presented in a very different way because it's a very different show. And what we did with that show, we were called in, my friend Rose Eveleth, who runs a Flash Forward podcast, who does this kind of work. She was called in beginning of last year to kind of help with the show, which was having some trouble around direction, and they needed some more input. And they called her in, and she then called me and my wife and a couple of people in to create a writer's room. And we sat around, and it was a fascinating, an amazing collaborative experience. One of the best collaborative experiences I've had. We spent 6 months last year on Zoom calls like this, hours and hours of Zoom calls every day, just coming up with ideas for this TV show, and then writing up long detailed treatments about these ideas. But what happens then is you then give these ideas to a production company, and that's it. My control then ends over it. So it's been interesting this week. I'd seen various cuts during the last few months, But it was interesting this week to see the show up, because it's the first time I'd seen a lot of it, right? And certainly in its kind of polished final state. And it's not necessarily what we envisioned for the ideas, but they are there. The essence of them is there. And it's just going to be, it's going to be fascinating seeing people react to that show. Mainly people who don't know me. It's going to be see how they react to it. But also people who do know my work, and it might feel a little confusing. But in each of those shows, the issues are there, and the issues about surveillance and privacy are mentioned in the shows. The issues about capitalism, and we try to get away, and the producers managed to keep at least nods to it in. That these technologies look very exciting, but they're only they're only for rich people a lot of the times, right? And there's like one episode there that we actually had our names removed from, because it was about space tourism, and we didn't want to talk about that because that seems like such a technology just for the elite. It's just like something that most people won't. It's not a future for most people. It's a future for a small number of people. So if you watch the show, you'll see our names aren't on that in the credits of that show. But it's interesting what they've done, and I'm always fascinated by how you go around communicating the future to a wide public audience, to a mass market kind of audience. Something I've played with doing a little bit of my work, but I realized that my work's maybe for a more niche audience a lot of the time, with people already interacting with these issues. So yeah, it's fascinating. That's been a really interesting project. But yeah, like I say, I love collaborating with people on things that I don't know how to do. Right, that's where you collaborate with people. I had a really good experience working with these other writers on Netflix. Before that, I didn't really think about collaborating with writers very often, because I kind of understand writing and how it works. I want to collaborate with people who work in completely different mediums to me, right? And have skills that I don't have, and I can sit there and be kind of in awe of what they do as they're doing it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, well, to conclude this conversation, I'd like to know if you're working on any new story or project, and what issues would you like to address right now, if they have changed since your first novel, and what books can you recommend, either fiction or non-fiction, concerning the topics we've discussed?
There's an excellent book which I'd like to recommend. I'm going to have to give me a second while I check the name of it, because I always get this wrong. Sorry, I'll start that again in a sec. So there's a book by Tim Maughan, who's an incredibly smart guy based in the US, called the Subprime Attention Crisis, and it's a book about how he argues very well that so much of the internet is based upon advertising money, right? That's why Google's rich, that's why Facebook are rich, that's why every website you go to, adverts, like it's 1997 again. It's that everything is advertising. YouTube, everything is advertising technology, but there's a real concern that this might not work for much longer, and that it's very precarious, and if people just stop buying things via advertising, that market could collapse. And what happens then? Right, everything on the internet is based on this money. What happens? Where does it go? Who starts paying for this stuff? Is there a future where actually all these new media companies become old media companies because their business models collapse, and the Murdochs and the Sinclairs of the world kind of come in and kind of buy these companies up again, and we just revert to that? That might be one of the more optimistic outlooks, because there might be that a lot of these companies are just left to die. Interesting platforms, places where interesting work's being done, not just places where interesting work's being done, but where work is being done, right? Platforms. There's people who make their entire living off being YouTubers now, or selling their music through Spotify, or for etc., being influencers. If these platforms collapse because the advertising model collapsed, that whole world changes. It's a fascinating book, and I really recommend that as a non-fiction book that's really affected me in the last couple of years. What I'm working on at the moment, I am working on a novel at the moment. It's still in reasonably early stages. It shouldn't have been in really early stages. It should have been finished by now. But the pandemic happened, and the book I was writing on the pandemic suddenly seemed not out of date, but it seemed unimportant, right? I was deliberately trying to write a book that was a bit more trivial in some ways, or was about a certain different class of people, a more privileged class of people, a kind of a more satirical book I was trying to write. And I suddenly just lost interest in doing that. I didn't really care about the people I was writing about, even in a critical or kind of sarcastic way. Or ironic way. I didn't really want to spend time with the people in that book. And so that book got cancelled, and then I cancelled that book, and then I started writing another book which was directly about the pandemic, and then realized I didn't want to do that either. So I cancelled that. And now I'm writing another book, which is about some of the things that came out of the pandemic, especially around the role of retail and the economy and stuff like that. And I don't want to go into too much detail because it's still early days, isn't it? But hopefully it'll be a lot of fun and kind of surprising to people. What was interesting was that I had written a proposal for this book, a novel about the pandemic and what the pandemic society post-pandemic might look like. And like I said, I scrapped the idea because it just seemed too close. But I spent some of last year working on a project for the World Health Organization, which hasn't been released yet, and I can't say too much about it, but actually kind of, there's a fiction project and it kind of touched on the same thing. So that was really fascinating. And I got approached to kind of do that work, totally coincidentally. Otherwise, I'm kind of I'm just trying to get this novel done this year is my main thing, but I've also got other things going on. I'm working on a couple of articles for magazines at the moment, which will be out in the next few months. There's always pieces of short fiction. I'm very, very blessed in that I get to write short fiction when people ask me to. I get asked to write it a lot. And I get commissioned to write short fiction a lot, which is an incredibly privileged place for an author to be. And I'm very, very excited and very, very in debt to the people that kind of ask me to do that. I also do, like I was mentioned earlier, I do certain kind of consultancy work, which again involves fiction, where I write pieces of short fiction for organizations, like I said, like WHO is one of them, but sometimes corporations, sometimes companies, sometimes government bodies and stuff, where they're trying to think about the future. Maybe they're working with actual proper futurists to see what the issues affecting those organizations are going to be in the next few years. And they'll sometimes call me in and I'll write short pieces of fiction to illustrate those as a way of communicating that to other people. So that's kind of what I'm working on at the moment here and there. I really just want to be here making beats, though, if I'm honest with you. Jimmy.
Yes, okay. Is there some place where we can listen to your music?
So yes and no, not officially, but yeah. So my wife, I'll give a plug to my wife. My wife made a series of films the last few years. Her name's Saheli Singh, and she did a project called Screening Surveillance. I think it's screeningsurveillance.com is the website. And there's a series of short films about surveillance issues in the near future. And they're fictional films, but they're based on research done by real academics, her colleagues at various places. She's worked, who've done research around surveillance. One of those films I wrote and I did the music for as well. The film's called Model Employee. It wasn't a plan to do the music at all. It was never the plan. There's a couple of scenes in the film that are set in a club. And the filmmaker, when she was making it, she used just some, random club tracks. And then when I was sat with her, in fact, on the day, helping her with some edits on the film. And she was like, I can't use this music. What other music have we got? And I was like, I don't know. And she was like, my wife was like, what about your music? And I was like, no. And they forced me into putting the music in the film. So that's probably the only place you can hear my music at the moment, I think. But maybe, I keep saying this, and then every year I don't want to, for the same reasons. Like I kind of just do this stuff myself. But maybe this year I'll release some stuff. Maybe I'll go on Bandcamp. Just won't be on Spotify because I'm sorry, I just can't start Spotify.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim, for this very wonderful dialogue. And well, I hope we can see you in physical presence anytime soon.
That would be wonderful, man. That would be great. It'd be great to get down there and see you guys. But seriously, though, thank you so much for everyone, for the publishers, everybody for putting this together. Thanks for Javier. These have been amazing questions, really. I do a lot of these, and it's great to get really smart questions, and it's great to to see that someone's kind of connected with and understood the book. It's the only thing that makes it worthwhile, really. You know, we don't write novels for the money anymore. So it's nice to understand that we're communicating to people and get through to people. So thank you for this, man. Thank you so much.
Okay, Tim. Thank you.